Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Kalayim, Pedig Gimel, Halacha Aleph, and God willing, starting today, Halacha Beis. We are learning Daf Chav Ches, Daf Koyach. We left off on Daf Chav Ches on the Aleph, 2 lines on the top of the Amid. We did not learn last week, and therefore it's very important, Dafka today, for those of us who are here live, to refamiliarize ourselves with some basic principles upon which we'll be able to appreciate the daf, the sugya that we will, God willing, start today. So first of all, the general idea that there has to be a certain gap of space between different plantations, between different plants, different species. That's a yusoid in the whole Mesachtas Kalayim. However, we did learn that there's a big difference between Yerakos and Zeroyim. And by the way, Halacha Beis will further clarify the definition of and the application of Yerakos and Zeroyim. Let's use the words vegetables, all right? Even though literally Yerakos means greens, which is extremely important for today's Mishnah later, but vegetables versus when we say Zeroyim, literally meaning grains, we also include in it legumes, all right? So that's the 5 grains and all else that's in the category of kitnios. And the rule is like this. And that's going to be our approach. When you have different plantations of zeroyim, if they are planted in an area that's defined as a sodeh, which is a little bit bigger than a beis roiva, then the separation between 2 different sodois of zeroyim has to be of a beis roiva, with many details. It can be maybe only a beis roiva by a beis roiva, then it can taper off. People should not imagine there has to be a beis roiva, which we're going to go with 10.2 amas separation. It doesn't have to go throughout, but there has to be a beis roiva somehow in there. If it's fields, if it's zeroyim less than a field, then we learned, guys, remember this, it depends whether they are planted as a square, meruba, whether they're planted as a meshar, as a rectangular, which is furrows, which is the norm. And by furrows, we learned that you have to have, by Zeroyim, 2 amas between one nation and the other, even though the Mishnah never said the word 2 amas, the Mishnah in Dat Tezayin, Machlekes B'Shamay and Beisilo, which were very similar one to the other, but it's more or less 2 amas. When it comes to vegetables, we have a rule that less space is needed. And generally, we can say that between 2 fields of Yerakos, you only need to have 6 tefachim. But when you have individual Yerakos, however that's defined, there we only have to have 1 tefach and a half, even though we learned the Mishnah in the beginning of Perek Shlishi with the understanding that indeed it's a machlokes between the Chachamim, Tanakama, and Rabbi Yehuda, whether a tefach and a half or 1 tefach. We can go with that, but it's still, we don't pass like Rabbi Yehuda, so we're going to go with a tefach and a half. We also learned about the type of vegetable patch which was common, which had the size of a 6 by 6. Theoretically, when we learned the Mishnah, we already spoke out, you can plant many more than 5 different types, depending whether you go with the heter of the word is going to come to me, of the triangular, Rosh Toir. Thank you. Whether we don't follow Rosh Toir, but we have from a pasuk in Yeshayahu a remez that you cannot have more, according to the Tanakama, than 5, according to Rabbi Yehuda 6, in a patch of 6 by 6. Let's go with the Rashi's understanding that we're not using the heter of Rosh Toir, that inside this patch itself, you need to have 1.5 tefachim between one type and the other. Then the Mishnah spoke about a scenario which was also probably common, as we finally clarified it, is that when you have a 6 by 6 patch, it was common for them to put around it a goivel, a border. The border had a height of a tefach, it had a width of a tefach. People wanted to plant on top of the goivel. So there, the Tanakama says you can have a total of 13 different species because you're planting 12 on the goivel, leaving 1.5 tefachim in between one and the other. Why can't you still keep 5 inside? That should be 17. No one says 17. So we learned, this is important, that you still need a tefach and a half. And even though the goyvel has a height of a tefach, but you're missing a half, so you have to go in a half on each side. That's a total of a tefach. You only have 5 by 5. That's the way the Rash learned the Mishnah. Then we had on Daf Chavdala, this is important, that Bechlal the goyvel is not counted. Even though it's high a tefach, it doesn't count at all. You need to have a tefach and a half inside the patch of 6 by 6. Each side, a tefach and a half, east-west, north-south, it's only 3 by 3. And since you're not planting the full 6 by 6, you can only plant one type. Even though theoretically you can also plant more and leave a tefach and a half. Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can plant on the border 12 and inside 6. That's a total of 18. That's where we left off. Now, we had a series of inquiries on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, and the last inquiry was based on a rule that we're going to learn soon in the Lametz, the rule of Muksha. Muksha is a melon-like type of plant, melons, including gourds, including the Egyptian bean, the Pula Mitzri. We're going to learn this soon together. Their vines and leaves are very extensive, very extensive. It's only the Rabbanan that when you plant rows of these types of muksha, and in between you want to plant your average yirakos, the example the Gemara is going to give later is of an onion, a row of melon, a row of onions, a row of melon. Even though when it comes to yirakos, chavre, the space that we're talking about, max normally a 6 by 6. It's either 1.5 or 6 by 6. That's 1 amma. You have to have 12 amas. 12 amas. 12 amas is more than a base raiva. Crazy. In between one and the other. That's the din of a much. The last inquiry that we had is what happens if you have a row of melons and you have a row or gourds or pulamits. Then you have a row of onions. But in between it, you have the goivel. And the way we made the mistake in the beginning, not you're planting on top of the goivel. The final inquiry was, no one is planting on top of the goivel. Do we say that the goivel will allow us to diminish the space between these two? Or do you still need to have the 12 amas? And that was the last inquiry. And the Gemara on the top of Daf Chav Ches says, no, that the goivel won't be matzel, won't make an effect. You still have to have the 12 amas. We're going to have now on today's Daf one more inquiry. Now that we have this information, it's going to be geschmack and it's going to push it forward. And then we're going to begin with halacha beis. Halacha beis is predicated on what we just chazed from halacha aleph, this general rule that when you have a patch of 6 by 6, 5, according to the Tanakama. If you're planting on top of the goivel, which gives you the total of 8 by 8, because the goivel was a tefach on each side. So if it's taka 8 by 8, then you can plant according to the Tanakama 13 total. Here, the Mishnah is going to further differentiate between Zurayim and Yerakas. Now, we're going to keep our approach that the definition Bechlal of a zera is something that's planted and its seed itself could be eaten or will be eaten, like grains. I know you can replant the wheat, but you can make popcorn. You can toast it. You can make it into oatmeal. People eat those grains. Yerakas is defined by plants. We call them greens because you don't eat their seed, you eat their greens. Now we're going to see that there are certain absolute yerakas, but there are certain plants that depending on your kavanah for why did you plant it, is it that you want to eat the greens or whether you want to eat the seeds, it's going to change the definition of halachically whether it's yerakas or zarayim. We're going to read the words that I'm saying now in the Rashi Ilio, that since whenever people plant something and they don't want to eat the seed, they do not leave it in the ground that long. They don't need to. They only want to eat the leaves. The leaves develop very quick. Whoever made the Lubavitcher science experiments of putting up a seed in a cup in front of the window and then the greens grow out, I mean, that's as far as I got. You know that the greens grow very quick. And therefore, you don't leave it in the ground that long. And therefore, it doesn't take that much nourishment. All of these words in the Rashi Ilio. And therefore, it's enough a tefach and a half. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, 1 tefach. If you are planting something and you want to eat its seed, you will leave it in the ground longer. And therefore, it's going to draw more nourishment. And you don't have this heter of only 1 tefach and a half, even though otherwise it could still be called yerakos. For these dinim, it's going to be called zerayim. That will be the first the halacha of the second Mishnah. And the second, which is separate, is the din of a goivel. A goivel, we keep on saying, has a tefach of height. Question will be, what happens if when you planted the 12 on the goivel, it had a tefach of height, but then it got diminished to under a tefach? Do you have to uproot the 12? Can you leave the 12? Can you plant more? It's going to be gavaldik. And the Gemara, we'll see how far we get, will differentiate between the din of a goivel versus the din of a goder. If you remember, we learned before that a goder is defined by 10 tefachim. And when you have a goder, even though the Gemara spoke about planting on top of the goder, but the Mishnah did not speak about that. The Mishnah just told you that if you have a fence, then I can plant two different types of plants all the way up to the fence on either side, even though the width of the fence is minimal, because the height of 10 tefachim is mafsik, marasayin. It looks like it's separated. What will happen by the fence if you plant it on both sides and then the fence got diminished? And we will see that it's different than the din of a goivel. That's about chavches. And now, chavre, with tremendous joy, it's good to be back. Let's go now inside. Again, the second line by the dot, muksha. So now we're going to go into another detail. When we quoted last year and now in the quick intro, the din of a muksha, muksha doesn't only refer to melons, it refers to other plants that are melon-like, meaning that their vines and their leaves are very long. And that includes gourds, that includes Egyptian bean and others. Now we're going to differentiate between muksha itself, between a melon itself and a gourd. So let's see. Muksha atzmai, concerning the muksha itself, it's not generally putting melons and gourds and Egyptian beans in category A, and let's say putting onions in category B, which is what we're going to learn later. You have to have 12 amas in between rows. But in the muksha itself, ma'ushiyatzil v'roish hagoivel. What does that mean? That means that if you plant gourds in one row and melons in another row, Rabbi Yochanan is going to say later you need to have 8 amas in between them, not 12, 8, less. Now, what will happen if one of them is planted on top of the border? Not the last inquiry was on the sides. Do we say that if it's planted on top of the border, can you minimize the need of the 8? To how many? The Gemara doesn't even ask, because the end will be that you cannot, so it doesn't make a difference. The previous inquiry was muksha, melon-like, and onions. You have to have 12, one on one side of the goivel, one on the other side of the goivel. Do you still need to have 12? Yes. Now the Gemara is asking another question. If I'm planting one row of melons and one row of gourds, which could be included in the muksha category, but we still separate them. And there we say, between this and that, you have to have 8, according to Rabbi Yochanan. One of these two are planted on top of the border, maybe less than 8. And the Gemara attempts to give an answer as it did above, and it's right away going to clarify that you cannot answer the same answer. So this is the attempted answer. That mo im zerayim b'zerayim, whenever you have zerayim and zerayim, like we mentioned, and there you have to have between 2 fields a base raiva. And I know that we keep on saying 10.2. The Gemara says 10.5. That's not unusual. The Gemara rounds off things according to our. We have a lot to lean on. That it's 10.2. Other Rishonim say 10.5. But we're going to stick with that with one shita. Shehei nitzolim be'eser amos u'mechza, and nevertheless, einam nitzolim b'roish hagoivel. This is important. In other words, if you have one group of zeroim planted on top of a goivel, that for sure doesn't make any difference. Whenever you have to have the shade of a base roiva, whether there's a goivel in between, whether you're planting on top of the goivel is only 1 tefach height, doesn't do anything. So muksha, which you need to have normally 8 amas, if you have to have 8 amas, for sure, like kolchrein, that one of the two, let's go the melons on top of the border and the gourds on the side of the border, for sure, you still need the required 8 amas. Now, obviously, this makes no sense, because maybe when you need to have 10.5 amas, the goivel doesn't help you. But whenever you only need 8, so then it's less. A kal v'chomer only goes in the other direction. That's what the Gemara is saying right away. Amar Rabbi Yudin, the father of Ramatanya, hold on. V'hon, who kolchchein? It's not a kal v'chomer, it's the other way around. In other words, look inside the Marafulda. The Marafulda is around 16 lines from the top. It's more or less the middle of the narrow lines. It's in Divrei Hamaskel Mo Im Zroim B'Zroim. Ube'emes by the dash Einoi kolchchein. It's not a kolchchein. Dihi Hanaysenes, the opposite. Choyil ve'einu tzarach kolkach. It doesn't need to have a 10.5 or 10.2, right? It only needs to have 8. So maybe kil hula hatzel b'roish goivel. Maybe the goivel, if one of the two, if the melons are on top of the goivel, maybe that will be enough. Oh. So therefore, your attempt at kal v'chomer does not work. However, says the Gemara, Elohachinu, this is going to be the way we can give the answer to the question. Guys, we're going with the Girsa be'eser amo mechza. Right, we already explained that. So if you have a field of Zroim planted on top of a goivel, makes no difference. And you have a neighboring field planted on the ground, you have to have the same base roiva. We don't say the goivel diminishes it. It doesn't do anything. Now Muksha is like this, that Chizkiya argues with Rabbi Yechanan. It's only Rabbi Yechanan that holds that even though the Mishnah says by Muksha you have to have 12 ames, says Rabbi Yechanan, yeah, that's in between Muksha-like and onions. But between melons and gourds, or gourd, Rabbi Yechanan says only 8. Chizkiya says you still need 12. So the Gemara says that I have the answer not according to Rabbi Yechanan. I have a kal v'chomer answer according to Chizkiya. Now it's mamish like the same way we answered the inquiry of Daf Chav Zayin Omid Beis, going into the top of Daf Chav Ches that we just finished reviewing. Same answer will be over here. That if when you have to only have 10 and a half, Muksha doesn't help at all, whether it's on the sides, whether it's on the top. So according to Chizkiya, that by Muksha, you have to have 12. 12 amas is more than 10 and a half. Certainly planting any of them on top of the goivel makes no difference. You still need to have the same 12. And that's a kal v'chomer because you're going from 10 and a half to 12, not from 10 and a half to 8. So Muksha shu noitzel b'shtei mesrei is like kolchchein. Or in other words, the Gemara is saying that according to Rabbi Yechanan, we don't have an answer. That's what the Gemara is saying. But according to Chizkiya, we do have an answer. Okay, beautiful. Now we're moving on to halacha base, and like we mentioned, the ratio of halacha base is going directly behemshech to halacha aleph that laid out the general rule that when you have a vegetable, only vegetables, yirakas, a patch of 6 by 6, in which according to the Tanakama you only have to have 1.5 tefachim between each types. Based on a verse, you can't put in more than 5, but you could put 5 in the 6 by 6. But that's only if you're using up the entire 6 by 6. If you also want to plant vegetables on top of the border that's surrounding it, the border had 1 tefach height and 1 tefach width. So on top of the border, you can put 12 and go back in the Mishnah halacha aleph. And I'm gonna purposefully learn our Mishnah now the way we learned it on Daf Chav Dalid, which is that the height of the goivel doesn't diminish any of the 1.5. So when you're planting on top of the goivel, if you want to plant inside, you still need to leave 1.5 from every border. If you have to put on each side 1.5, 1.5 and 1.5 is 3. North, south, 1.5 and 1 and 3. All you have left in the middle is 3 by 3. 3 by 3, you can only plant one type. Even though theoretically you can leave spaces, but we have a pasuk that when are you allowed to plant 5? Only if you have 6 by 6. Less, you can only plant 1. So that was the Mishnah that said, if you're planting on the goivel, only 13. That's the Tanakama. Again, Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can plant in a 6 by 6, 6 types. 6 types.
What if the goivel is as high as a fence?
That's a whole different rule. That's a fence is a much stronger separation.
Right.
Even though, Dan, if you remember, ironically, we learned that if I'm planting on this side of the fence and on that side of the fence, if I plant on the top, I ruined everything. We had that din before. How that aligns with goyvel, I don't know. I do want to say one thing. The fence did not have a minimum width. The goyvel has a tefach width. Maybe that's the difference. Okay. So first, we're going to further limit. We're going to qualify the rule that we just set out in Halacha Aleph. And that's connected to the very definition of Yerakos versus Zeroim. Says the Holy Mishnah. Kol min Zeroim. If whatever you are planting is in this narrow definition, defined as Zeroim, not as Yerakos, then ain't Zoyrin ba'aruga. This is very important. Okay? Now, how much space will you need? I can say one thing, guys. What we have until now by Zeroim is either a Beis Roiva or 2 amas. Forget about a tefach and a half. In other words, the heter of only relying on 1.5 tefachim, for it to be considered a proper separation, is only by Yerakos. And when the Mishnah says kol min Zeroim, as we'll see, it doesn't only mean the 5 grains. As we will see, that there can be certain vegetables that for this halacha, they can still be defined as Zeroim. Okay. Only b'chol min Yerakos zoyrim baruga. So that's Aleph. Now, let's go. Hachardo, mustard seeds, and va'afunim hashufin. There are different girsais. Either it means smooth beans or it means small beans, which also happen to be smooth beans. Now, one thing, guys, chardol is not from the not a zera, okay? And beans is not a zera. For these dinim, they are. Says the Mishnah, yes, min zeroim. That's the point. Only afunim hagimloinim. Let's touch it. The large beans, they are considered min yarok. Large beans, this will be the words, guys, are generally planted in small patches. Generally. Why are they planted in small patches? Because they don't draw a lot of nourishment. If you need nourishment, you need space. Why don't they need a lot of nourishment? Because people plant them to eat their greens and not to eat their seeds. In other words, there are certain types of plants that there is the general kavanah. Then we'll see whether your kavanah will make a difference. But the intent for what it was planted will make a difference. Benegeya, and look inside the cave and put a great picture of mustard greens growing. Okay. And the reason why we're calling it min zeroim, I'm going to say very clear, is because even though they have leaves, as we just saw, most people don't plant them only for their leaves. They plant them also for their seeds. And therefore, they have to leave them in the ground longer for the seeds to develop. That's the way it works. And therefore, draws more nourishment. And people therefore give it more space. So the whole method of you being allowed to plant 5 types in a 6x6 is only if this is something that's not left in the ground for a long time. Look inside. This is the words that I'm saying now before we go on is going to be in the Rashirilio. Look inside the right column. Okay, towards the bottom, Masnisa. Kol min zeroyim ein zoyrim baruga. And he says like this: when the Mishnah says min zeroyim, even though zeroyim literally means grains, it doesn't only mean that over here. Bein mine tvua, bein mine kitnios. First of all, we're putting always tvua and kitnios in the same category. And the word is kiven the mashuluhu mipnei zaron. Since people leave them in the ground because they want to take out of the ground their seed. Something that's planted primarily for the seed, loy shari, we're not allowed to plant 5 types in a 6x6 tefah. Ella, only vegetables. That what? The shalfa minayu kol yoyma shoichlanoisam ekil chamabizvam, that they are taken out of the ground every day, right? Because you want to eat their leaves, you want to eat their greens, their grass. That's what you're looking for. For example, tanoim, chazeres, and karpas, chayotze behem. Says weiter kolmin komoy komolocha leisasu the shum min zeroim ein zoyren the nikasam gedoyla. It takes a lot of nourishment. Ein zoyren noisen baruga. Loishna she'ein by goyvel, v'loishna she'esh by goyvel, loy lamata, v'loy begoyvel. Look inside the left column in the top by the Rashirilio. Kedemuchacha sugyan de lael. I b'hadetran chamisha ziroinim, a gimel ziroinim. Bishum dechsiv zeiruel naked hacheh. No, the irony is that the pasuk that we quoted in Yeshayahu uses the word Zeru'eha, but Zeru'eha is a very broad term, and it's dafka not in the subcategory of Zera, only in the subcategory of Irakas. Inami toner kol afilu zaron liyarak. Just to make it clear, as we'll develop this further, that there'll be certain, if you're planting a Zera, a tvua, even if you planted it liyarak, but ladaitoi. So we'll see there's certain categories that will be called zera always. You can never plant them in a 6x6. Certain categories that are called yarakos, no matter what you planted it for. But then you have these categories where we say, what do most people plant it for? And then what did you plant it for? And there, your kavanah will make a difference. And let's keep on reading in the Mishnah. And we'll have more details about this in the Gemara. Now comes the second part of the Mishnah. So the first part of the Mishnah is to limit it only to Yerakos. And to the Yerakos of the type that people generally plant them for their leaves. And therefore, they don't leave them in the ground long, and therefore they don't take a lot of nourishment, and therefore you can pack them in. Now, the din of a goyvel, and the din of a goyvel that allows you to plant on top of a goyvel, 12 types, right? According to Bein the Tanakama, Bein Rabbi Yehuda, on top of a goyvel, 12, by only leaving a tefach and a half. All of that was when the goyvel was above the ground for a tefach, right? However, goyvel shoy goy tefach, but now the nismayet, and you have in the middle, let's go with the daf chav daled, you have in the middle a 3x3 patch packed in with another type. So you have a 13th in the middle. All you have is a tefach and a half. So we're saying, now, we're saying that kosher, you don't have an issue by saying, the goyvel doesn't have the qualification of a goyvel. We don't say that by the goyvel. We're very lenient. What we do say is that since shahoya kosher mitchila asai, so therefore, the heter of only needing 1.5 tefach remains, even though now it's less than a tefach and a half. A lot more again about this in the Gemara. Now, the final din in the Mishnah, which is really something that we quoted before, is that if you have a telam, a furrow, or if you have an amas hamayim, a water canal, and obviously that dried up, because in other words, the point is that you are able to plant inside of it. We're speaking about one that has at least a tefach depth and a tefach width. So it's an inverted goyvel. So says the Mishnah that as long as they have at least the amukim tefach, you can plant letoichan, and the meaning of letoichan in the Mishnah doesn't actually mean inside of it, because in a tefach of width you cannot plant 3 types. It means you can plant one inside, all the way from side to side, and right above on the right side another one, and right above on the left side a third one. We did learn in the Gemara before that you can only plant 3 and not 5. Where would you put 5? Right, left, right, east, west, north, south. That you can do, that you cannot do. But as long as you're leaving 2 sides open, it's only going 1, 2, 3 side by side. That's the chiddush, that the depth of the tefach is enough to make sure that these different plants do not appear to be mingled. And L'toichem, the Mishnah clarifies, that means echad mikan, ve'echad mikan, ve'echad be'emsa.
Our depth of one tefach is not visible from any distance.
I think there is a difference. First of all, it's not true. I think the amount of vegetables that you planted in these areas were minimal. The way I think, the way I can foresee it. And let's experiment.
Is it the depth, or is it the separation, the width of the?
I think it's both. It's the fact that indented in the ground. Listen, it's an inverted goyvel. The difference is that by the goivel above the ground, Kevan, you have to leave still space. You have to leave space. In the tefach, in the ground, you don't have to leave any space. That means that when you indent it in the ground, it appears to be even more separated. We should experiment. Guys, everyone is invited to Kevin's home this afternoon. We'll make a science experiment. We'll make we'll make a goivel above, we'll make a goivel inside. Kevin will put me in the bottom one, and he'll go on the top one, and let's see. That means then. It's amazing. All right. Huh?
Even by Chagzin, you can have Chagzin and Zera, like we discussed in the Mishnah.
Only by Yerakos. Only by Yerakos. Clear. Only Yerakos. I'm happy that Michal is making this point. Again, even though the Mishnah is using the generic word Shloisha Zeiroinim, the Mishnah already clarified all of this, that you have to have such a minimum space is only by products that are planted for their greens. And therefore, again, they're not left in the ground a long time. And therefore, they don't need a lot of nourishment. And therefore, farmers, b'chlal, don't give them space. Anything that the norm is to give them space, if you put them so close together, they look mixed. Those items that b'chlal are not given that much space, that's one, a tefach and a half, or inside the tefach depth, that's where this works. So, yeah. So
Rabbi.
Yes.
How is this furrow discussion here any different than what we were talking about on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph?
No.
The 27A2.
We quoted this.
A, B, and C. There was also 3. Is this the same thing that we're saying right now?
100%. But the 3 that we learned in the Barais and Daf Chav Zayin, Danny, was planting inside a furrow that was wide 6 tfachim, I think. Not I think. It was wide 6 tfachim.
No, it was 1 by 1.
No. That picture was this case. The picture that Kevin is showing is the case of the Mishnah. Yeah, but I'm saying if you go by it in the Gemara then spoke about planting inside, but that's not this. Yeah, this is a quote from our Mishnah. Species A, species B, species C.
Okay.
Okay, right. Let's say the Gemara. The Gemara is going on the ratio of halacha base. Kol min zeroim. So the Mishnah says that you have to know how to classify. How do you? What's the geder of Yerakos? And the Mishnah gives a couple of examples for a purpose. It says the Holy Mishnah that if you're planting mustard seeds, or again, our girsa afunim hashufim, smooth beans, which are small beans, even though they're not full, right? And chagdal has leaves, but they are not in the category of Yerakos. They are, for these halachas, in the category of zeroyim. And therefore, even if you, that's called batla daitoi in Talmud Bab, even if you decided to only plant them for their yerek, which would mean you don't plan to leave them in the ground that long, you don't need to leave them that much space, doesn't matter. Right? The Mishnah, let me say, the Mishnah's classification of chardol is absolute. Doesn't make a difference what your intent is. That's what the Gemara wants to point out. Now, Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis, you'll appreciate in contrast that when it comes to either the apunim, right, to the large beans, hagamloinim, or to pul hamitzri, all right, there, it's not across the board, Michal. By these beans, it's what was your kavanah. Certain things are yerek. Certain things are zera. Certain things, no, it doesn't make a difference. Certain things depends on what your intent is. That if you planted them lezera, which means when you put them in the ground, you're going to leave them longer because you want them to develop not only the leaves, but you want them to develop their seed. And therefore, they need a lot more ground. They need more nourishment. Therefore, people who planted with that intent should have left more space. Guys, just the word al-gaba aruga means the whole halacha aleph. Whether it's to be one of the 5 of the 6 by 6, whether you want to put it on top of the goivel, the common denominator of both is you only need to have a tefach and a half. You can't just say a tefach and a half. Why? Because you plan to leave it for its seed. But if you planted, what the Gemara is saying, these apunim.
So what does it need? It needs a base. What's the separation?
Very good, Danny. So then it depends. You're going to have you're going to have we have the 6 by 6 tefach, the 2 ames, or the beis roiva, depending on what we learned in the previous chapter. These are the 3. In other words, these are the steps. Tefach and a half, 6 tvachim. We also happen to learn, Danny, that 6 tvachim, if I remember correctly, midoy raisa is always enough for everything. Anything beyond 6 tvachim, if I remember correctly, the way we have been learning, is only a derabanan. The Gemara says. How much more will that be? From there, 6 tefach is 1 ame, even though there's an ame of 5 tefach, of 6 tefach, but then you have 2 ames, and then you have beis roiva. Now, if zera and liyarak, now yes, and finally says the Holy Gemara that that what? This is the key. That people do not eat its seeds. You see? She'einem cholim. It's gavaldik. And therefore, what? If you don't eat the seeds, they're called what? They're called vegetables. Other than these afunim hagamleinu and polamitzri, it's batla daitoi in the other direction. Lamalyusa. Even though you want to plant them for the seed. That's the Gemara makes it beautiful. In other words, you have mitzadzeh, umitzadzeh, and then you have in the in-between case. Certain absolutes, this is Yerek, this is Zera, and then you do have a category of what was your kavanah. Second case of the Mishnah was that the whole heter of the goyvel is dafka because the goyvel had a height of a tefach. Now, what happens if after you planted the 12 on the top, this might, nevertheless, it's kosher. Now, let's push this. Amar Rav Imi, Hadod da'at Amar, Lizroyim Shavoi, all the Mishnah is saying is that it's kosher for that which was already planted, but katchila, right? That's the last. But for you to lachatchila plant on a goyvel that doesn't have the height of a tefach, that is for sure prohibited. I want to make something clear. Prohibited would mean, just for the record, that if you did plant it, it has to be uprooted. But if you did plant, but here you have to add a couple of words. You know, when you planted it, Mechol, you had a tefach height, you have 12. The height got diminished. One of those 12, you ate up. You replanted in its place. But the old ones are still there. Now, how many of the old have to be there? I'm not certain. Maybe even only one. Maybe even only one. But if there is still from the old on top of the goyvel, so you planted new, but there's still the old. Says the Gemara, Gavaldik Chidish, Rav Imi, right? Said, ma'achar she'elu mutarim, elu mutarim. Now, Omar v'zara means you shouldn't have done it. But to say that since you transgressed, it has to be uprooted, yeah, you only have to uproot it if there was nothing left of the original. Or roiv, I'm not clear in that. But if there's nothing left, you have to uproot it. If you have from the old, avar, b'diavad, you can leave it. And we're going to make a phenomenal correlation between this and in the Sechtas Kalim. But to introduce that, the Gemara wants to now split it here in the final statement of Rabbi. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, Nicham, one thing is clear. Okay, guys, you have the old, you planted now new, now you ate up the new, you still have the old, hakol shor v'kayim. Right, nekru hashniyam rishayim mutarim. But what happens when you planted the new, the old was there? And therefore, Rav Imi says that ma'acha she'elu mutarim, elu mutarim. Very nice. But now you ate up the old. Now there is a rega where you only have the new. Nekru arishonim. So now Rabbi Yirmiyah wants to know, hashniyam mahein, what's now the getting it in of the second? Do we say, well, since Avar v'Zara, when the old were there, we already paskened elu mutarim, why would it become aser? Or does it only remain mutarim because you have the old? The moment you took away the old, it invalidates the new.
All right, can a person standing watching this see that it's old versus new? If he sees the old, he knows the erosion could have happened. If he sees the new, he doesn't know there was erosion. So he thinks it was planted on the eroded part. Is that correct?
I have no answer to your question, but you're making a good point, because normally by Marasayan, if it's about Marasayan, then how would you know? I don't know the answer to that. Okay, but now the Gemara says, listen to the connection, the Gavaldik. Nish answers the Gemara, Nishma'ina men Adam. The Masechtas Kelim, Pedek, you test, can you imagine? It's a big Masechta. First, a couple of rules, many of us just learned this in the Rambam. When you have a Keli, which will include a bed, just as an example, that has boards, this part is important just for the technicality of it. So you have boards on the length that go through the roiv of the bed. If the bed that became tamei was taken apart, generally in a way where the purpose for which the keli was made can no longer be realized, can't use it as a bed, then the tuma goes away. So the case over there was you had a bed that became tamei, and you made new sideboards, but the original boards are still usable. So there's going to be the original boards that are tamei. There's going to be the second that are tahar, and we're going to have a nuance which will be mamish like our question over here. In our case, the original plants were good. The second plants are only kosher because of the original. Okay, says the Mishnah, Hamita, when you have a bed, that if you removed the long boards that go across the length, you remove them to replace them with new ones. So the din is v'asolah es hachadashis, and you made new ones, but v'lo shina es hanekavim, which means you did not really change the bed itself, and therefore the old boards are still usable. So we say like this, that if the new boards were broken, the bed remains tamei. Why is the bed tamei? Because the bed is still functional, because when you have the old boards, then the bed is still tamei. But if now the old boards were broken, now the bed becomes tahor, which is quite amazing.
Hey.
And that's true, and there's a lot of nuance here, that even if the new boards that broke, are still attached to the bed, and when they broke, since you had the old boards, the bed remained tamei. If the old boards break, now the bed is tahor. Because, says the Mishnah, in other words, by the way, just make it clear, it's not that the old boards were attached, it's that the old boards are still here. Anytime that the old boards are here, and the holes which will allow you to attach them are still there the way they are, so you are able to reattach it, the bed remains tamei. The moment the old boards break, now the bed becomes tahor. Says the Gemara, that nekru hashniyim. Let's come back over here. That if the second plants were uprooted, but if nekru harishainim, which was the case of Rabbi Yirmiyah, even though when you planted the new ones, the chadashis, the evid, everything is kosher. It was only kosher because you had the old. The moment you remove the old, hashniyim asurim. When the old boards break, now the tumah leaves. When the old boards are here, not even attached, they're here, the bed remains tamei. Gewaldig. It's in the reverse, but that's the answer of the Gemara. And now we have another couple of minutes, so let's push forward. It says the Gemara. Okay, very good. So just to say, Michal is saying a very important dinim when it comes to boards, that they were speaking about whether the bed is tamei in tumas medres. I didn't check up, but it makes a lot of sense what he's saying. And the tuman tara is only whether the tumas medres leaves. Doesn't necessarily mean that the boards themselves. I'm not so certain about that because it's pshutei klei eitz. Anyways, let's leave it from a Masechtas Kela, but just this nekuda is like, says Rabbi Amar, that what? That Rab Ze'era and Rab Imi travayim b'shem Rabbi Yechon. Now, two Amoraim had a statement in the name of Rabbi Yechon, and as we will see, my friends, it's not the opposite statements. It's two different dinim. Both of them were attributed to Rabbi Yechanan. One was said b'shem Rab Ze'era, b'shem Rabbi Yechanan, and one b'shem Rabbi, b'shem Rabbi. One statement was Chadamar, Semchen legader, vein Semchen legoyvel. This is important, that the difference between a gader, a fence, and a goyvel, as we learned in our Mishnah, and guys, we're going to the way we learned in Adaf Chav Dalet, is there when you have a fence, a gader, I'm allowed to plant on one side of the fence all the way up to the fence, even if the fence's width is a mashu. Fence is 10 tfachim high. That separates. When it comes to a goyvel, even though you're allowed to, the goyvel has some chashivus, we got that. You can plant 12 types on top of the goyvel, shkoyach to you. But when it comes to the inside of the 6x6, you can't plant it all the way up until the border. Now, Kevin, why is the above the ground different than the Mishnah's in the ground? That's the din. So that's one statement. So the Rabbi Yechanan is differentiating between a geder and a goyvel. A geder is a better mechitza. You can plant all the way up to it. And the goyvel, either the way that Rash learns in halacha, that the goyvel at least is 1 from the 1.5, or the way we learned on Naf Chav Dalet, it's nothing. It's just height. You have to go inside of the border. You have to go 1.5 tefach on each side, only giving you 3x3. Now, V'charna Amar, the other one of these two Amoraim, quoted Rabbi Yechanan by saying a different din, that goyvel shenismayit kosher, the din that we just learned right now, the din in the Mishnah, that once you planted the 12 on the top, even though now the goyvel was diminished, you can leave them. Hogader shenismayit puzzle. That's gaval. In other words, guys, if I planted on both sides of the fence, right, that I'm allowed to do that, that's only as long as the fence is 10 tefachim high. The moment the fence goes down, then I have to uproot one of the sides, even though I planted it behead. Says Gemara v'lo yodin, and I don't know man amar do. However, min ma do amar Rabbi Yosef, that Rab Ze'era b'shem Rabbi Yechanan was the one that said Soimchim legader and Soimchim legoyvel. So obviously from that I know that Ravimi was the other one, the Amar, who said that goyvel shenismayit kosher, hagader shenismayit is pasul. Okay, the kid said it's not a stira. They're not arguing with each other, but at least we clarified which Amida quoted what din, and we have two different din in b'shem Rabbi Yechanan. We'll stop.